Hello everybody, welcome to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we're doing something really cool. We are going to be talking about the list that I brought to the top 16 of the Chaos Tournament 3. Now, this was a deck that before this tournament, I had literally never played before. The original brewing of the list, you can check a video for on this channel. We did a live stream where a bunch of people threw in suggestions, and I kind of went through the process of how to brew a cEDH deck from scratch. I made some edits to the deck from the point which we did that live brew, and today we're going to go over the deck as a full deck tech and talk about the inclusions in the list, why certain changes were made from that live brew, and kind of go from there. But this is the Jetmir list that I took from never being played before to the top 16 of over 100 people at Chaos 3. So I feel really proud of the performance of the deck. To be honest, the results of the deck during the Swiss were really solid. I went 2-1-1, 2 wins, 1 loss, 1 draw with the deck, and to be honest, I think it could have easily gone 4-0 with how well it performed during the day and how comfortable I felt piloting the deck with how many pivots were available and things like that. So without any further ado, let's talk about this deck. But before we get into the deck itself, let's talk about how we got to this deck. So I asked my patrons to suggest decks that they wanted me to play for this tournament. They suggested a bunch of different decks, and I took the top options from there as well as the top options from a Twitter thing that I had done a little earlier that day just to see if the community had any really hot takes they wanted me to play. So between all of those results, I put a poll up on Twitter, and you can see the graphic right about here, and you can see Jetmir won pretty definitively overall, and I said, heck yeah, let's play it. I made some changes, as I said, from that initial list we brewed live. Once again, that video I will leave down below. But if you want to be part of fun experiments like this, and patrons were a huge part of me doing this, please feel free to check out patreon.com/comedianmtg if you want to support the channel, stuff like this. If you want your name in the notes at the end of the show, go check out that patreon.com/comedianmtg. And if you enjoy videos like this, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Thank you so much, folks. Without any further ado, let's break down Jetmir win-con-less stacks for cEDH. So it wouldn't be a deck that I play if it didn't have a super memey name. And I was getting a lot of people during this tournament who were just absolutely baffled by the fact that I was playing Jetmir in a cEDH tournament. First of all, I do think this commander is cEDH viable. I don't think there's really a question about that. I think that this deck is actually a real deck, and after its performance the other day, I'm actually way more hyped on it than I had been. When the card was first printed, I was really high on it. Then as time went on, I was kind of going through the brew that we made. I didn't really like a lot of the opening hands that were showing up, but then with the optimizations I made in between the time that Twitter voted for it and the tournament itself, and the way it actually played out in this tournament, I'm actually really hyped on this deck right now, and I would play this to another tournament coming up. And my reactions from my opponents were hilarious. Some of them were just, you know, knew who I was, knew what I did as far as like brewing and stuff like that, and they definitely like didn't question as much. But there were definitely some people who, even after the game, they were making comments like, wow, you know, when I first saw Jetmir, I thought it was kind of a joke, but now I kind of get it after the game was done. But let's go talk about this deck. What it does mainly, as I mentioned, it's win-con-less stacks. And what does win-con-less stacks mean? It doesn't literally mean it's impossible to win the game, but what it means is that it doesn't have a definitive win condition or a combo in the list, right? The actual win condition of this deck is resolving your commander and beating your opponents to death. And sometimes you don't even need the commander to do that, although Jetmir is a fantastic way of saying the game is going to end right freaking now. So what does Jetmir do? Let's talk about the commander so that way we can understand how it's basically like having a Craterhoof Behemoth in the command zone. So it's a 5/4 for only 4 mana. And the fact that it costs 4 mana is kind of huge. A lot of people were asking me about different variants on win-con-less stacks. And I mentioned multiple times that the fact that you can cast Jetmir for 4, and the fact that we're in green, right, that makes your mana situation way easier in a lot of aspects. You can cast it for 4, then you can cast it for 6, then you can cast it for 8, then you can cast it for 10. And those are all feasible in a game that you're trying to draw out longer and longer. So Jetmir itself says creatures you control get +1/+0 and have vigilance as long as you control 3 or more creatures. Now, giving your creatures vigilance is actually really huge in a game you're trying to draw out longer and longer, because it basically means that you're putting in a ton of damage and you're not just wide open for the crackback. Then the second part of that ability is creatures you control also get another +1/+0 and have trample as long as you control 6 or more creatures. So now you're not only are you giving +2/+0 in vigilance, you're also trampling over. So first of all, death touch becomes insane with this deck because you only need to assign 1 point of lethal damage to a creature if you have death touch and trample. It's a really cool interaction as far as Magic is concerned. And so now you can start trampling over your opponents. They're not chump blocking anymore with their creatures because your creatures are doing just so much damage. And then if you have 9 creatures, and to be clear, Jetmir counts. It does not say 9 other creatures. It does not say 3 other creatures. It does not say 6 other creatures in any of these abilities. Jetmir counts as part of these abilities. But it says creatures you control get +1/+0 and have double strike as long as you control 9 or more creatures. Now that may not sound like the most feasible thing, but when you are playing 45 creatures like this deck is, not including the commander, you're playing 45 creatures and your entire point of your deck is to play early mana dorks and then ramp into more and more stacks pieces. I had multiple games where I just had 9 by the time I first cast my commander. I was playing some value creatures, generating a bunch of advantage, and then I played my commander and I ended the game right there. One advantage that this deck has over a deck like something like Winota is that it does not need the commander to do its thing. So as someone who plays a ridiculous amount of Winota as the Winota author, right, for the original primer list, this deck doesn't need to rely on its commander as much, and also doesn't fold to as easy pieces like Dranith or Grafdigger's Cage, things that stop you casting your commander, stuff like that. Now your commander is really a piece of this deck that is very important in the sense that you are putting a ton of damage on the battlefield as soon as your commander resolves. It's your win condition in a longer sense, but there are ways around that too. I just think that's really important to mention as we go through this list. So let's go through each section. I'm going to leave the creatures for last because 1, they're the most important, and 2, there's just so dang many of them. So the instance, we have our basic removal suite. We have Worldly Tutor and Eldamir's Call and Court of Calling. So we have removal and ways to get your creatures, because 45 creatures, there's bound to be a lot of really important ones. Want to get them to the battlefield as soon as possible. Artifacts, the only mana rock I play is Soul Ring. I was talking with Sick Robot because he actually was pretty interested in this list after the tournament result, and he was saying Soul Ring was pretty cuttable. I found it to be helpful in certain games I was playing, but for context, I'm playing Null Rod, I'm playing Collector Oof, and I am playing Stony Silence, on top of the fact that I'm also playing some other artifact hate pieces. So, oh yeah, Root Maze is one of them. I found Soul Ring helpful. It doesn't really have a downside like Mana Crypt where it slowly kills you over time. Soul Ring was fine. It could be cut. It really doesn't matter that much. I found it helpful enough because of some of our more expensive pieces that you see towards this end of the deck that do require a little bit of ramping, but we have other ways to get to that point. So just worth noting. Damping Sphere. This was my last addition to the deck. After I make this video, I will be cutting Damping Sphere because it's just so awkward with Gaia's Cradle in our deck. As much as I love having the anti-storm option in this card, Gaia's Cradle is just such an impactful piece for this list, and shutting down our own Gaia's Cradle is really, really painful, so I probably will be cutting Damping Sphere for another stacks option. Null Rod. So later we're going to talk about the rule of law effects in this deck and the fact that we're only playing one of them, which might be a bit of a hot take, but I think we can do that because we're playing all 3 of the artifact hate pieces. So we are playing Null Rod, as I mentioned, Collector Oof, and Stony Silence. Artifacts are a huge part of the fastest decks in the format, of Rog Silas, of Blue Farm, of all of these Turbo ad nauseam strategies, and if you play a Null Rod, you will do significant damage to those lists. That, and combined with tax effects, really makes it so that they have a really, really hard time of breaking through what you're doing. So I am very happy with the fact that we're playing all 3 of these and would not change that from the deck. That is one thing in this list that I would not change at all, is the inclusion of those 3 pieces. Thorn of Amethyst, great tax effect. We are playing Thalia, traditional Thalia. Guardian yeah, Guardian of Thraben. I always get the two Thalias mixed up. But we're playing Guardian Thalia, so we're playing Thorn of Amethyst as well. Thorn just does enough to slow your opponents down, and it's a very impactful piece. So as I mentioned, the only rule of law we're playing is Deafening Silence, and there is a lot of thought that went into that decision. I really don't want people to think that that is something that we went through quickly. The reason for this is this deck does really well at gaining a lot of card advantage, which is weird for a Naya deck, but because of cards like Onoda, we're playing Toski, we're playing Orin Frostfang, we're playing Sisei, which allows us to tutor and have cards to play in our turn, playing Yisan, playing Professional Facebreaker. So a lot of these pieces actually, despite our colors, allow us to have a decent amount of card advantage. And with our tutors for creatures and things like Sylvan Library to keep drawing us cards, it's very easy to get a piece like Toski onto the battlefield. Toski, I actually found myself tutoring that card quite a lot when I was playing the deck on Saturday in the Chaos tournament. So because of that, I found that Toski was such an important piece, and I found that our card advantage actually allowed us to just continually generate a ton of advantage through a lot of different stacks pieces. However, shutting off our ability to continue to play more and more creatures, right? Because an important part of this deck is that we're not really breaking parity on Rule of Law with our commander. Right, a deck like Winota gets to play Rule of Laws because Winota says, I don't care about the Rule of Law effect on the battlefield. That's why decks like Kodama also play Rule of Law effects, because they get to go around the Rule of Law. Same things with decks like Oswald, Fiddlebender, right? These decks go around what's happening with the Rule of Law. This deck does not do that, and therefore we can't really play an actual Rule of Law effect. So that is why we are only playing Deafening Silence, because the majority of the deck, as you can see, 45 creatures in this list. And if you count like the 32 lands, that leaves only a very small amount of things that are not creatures. And therefore, Deafening Silence really does not hinder us almost at all. A really spicy include here is Reconnaissance. So if you notice something about Jetmir's ability, it only adds to power. And until you get to that 9 creatures on the battlefield, the last part of its ability, it is actually kind of hard to guarantee that when you're pushing through that damage, you're not going to lose a few creatures. It's definitely an awkward dynamic of the deck, and one that made it tough when I was first looking at the list. So one thing to note, Reconnaissance literally never showed up during this tournament. I still would include it, given the fact that I think the method in the madness makes sense. I think Reconnaissance still makes sense in this deck a lot. I think you just need something to kind of guarantee that certain combats you are going to just dominate, and I think Reconnaissance does that. And it basically makes it so that your attacks are ones that are going to continually go through. Now, there might be an argument for a card like Dolmen's Gate instead, which does the same thing. Now this is colorless and it costs 2 mana, so it's just a matter of Reconnaissance is 1 cheaper, and Reconnaissance also can be sort of cheated to give your creatures a pseudo vigilance effect for when Jetmir is not on the battlefield, because of the way damage works in Magic. So right now Reconnaissance is just in because it's cheaper, but I can also see Dolmen Gate being a swap that does the same thing, or I can also see doubling up on it and playing both of those. Root Maze I didn't get to see during the competition specifically, but during testing it has kind of played out really well, as far as we don't really care about artifacts, and our lands coming in kind of gets offset by the fact that we have just a buttload of mana dorks. Utopia's Raw Wild Growth I think are just kind of solid options in the deck, not really much more to be said. They're non-artifact ramp pieces. Blind Obedience, another artifact hate piece, also really important for being a tempo piece when you're playing a stacks deck that cares about damage. Tempo is actually really important in cEDH for stacks decks, especially ones that care about your opponents having things in tapped. I think, in fact, you see tempo mattering the most when it comes to stacks decks, period, in cEDH. So Blind Obedience is a solid option. It stops creature combo decks that can break parity on this stuff. So like decks like Kiki-Jiki decks can't go off through Blind Obedience. Things like Dockside get severely stopped by Blind Obedience, and the Extort ability is actually relevant when you look at a longer game of cEDH. It kind of is that damage. So say You have an opponent who finally manages to stabilize their life total at like 3 or 4. Blind obedience, because we're not playing a rule of law effect and we do generate a lot of mana towards the late game. It's just a little bit of chip damage over and over again that eventually chips away at your opponent's lives. Rest in Peace is awesome. We don't care about our graveyard at all. So Rest in Peace is great. And then Semifinals, we've already talked about a good amount. Last category before we go to creatures, sorceries. Green Sun Zenith gets just so many stupid cards in our deck. Cards like Avabrook Caretaker, Archon of Valor's Roots, Tendershoot Dread, Orin Frostfang Toski. Remember how it said how important that card is. Yisan, Captain Sese. It gets Collector Roof, Fabro Elder, Outland Liberator. Collector Roof especially, right? Super important. Sylvan Safekeeper, another really important card to be able to get for 2 mana. Green Sun Zenith is awesome. Finale Devastation, great for that reason. As I mentioned, in the late game, we generate a ton of mana, so there are worlds where we can cast it for 10 plus. I did not do that during the competition. I'm going to save this one for last. Natural Order, I did not see. However, with the large green creatures in our deck, being Avabrook Caretaker, Archon Valley's Reach, Tendershoot Dread, Orin Frostfang, I think Natural Order is worth the include. It helps to have just a tutor where you can slap something ginormous onto the battlefield. Playing Natural Order is also like a kind of a reason to play Craterhoof Behemoth, maybe, despite us having Craterhoof Behemoth in the command zone, quote, quote. I don't actually, like, I know it's usually associated with casual commander, but I think Craterhoof Behemoth is actually a worthy consideration for this list, to just should give you a ton of context on what type of deck this is. Winds of Abandon. This card won me multiple games this weekend. This card's awesome. It's a huge tempo swing. When you're developing so many cards onto your battlefield, the ability to have a way to exile everything that's a threat on the battlefield as far as creatures, and open up a scenario in which your opponents are not able to put more blockers onto the battlefield, it's awesome. It also, like, I played in a matchup where I was going against 2 Rector style decks, so I was playing against Minsk and Timna Tana in a deck that was clearly like a Rector style deck, and the ability to just wipe their boards completely when it was clear 2 of them had creature combos that I wasn't able to interact with coming through the next turn was awesome. And then it also straight up won me I guess it didn't win me a Stacks Mirror, because that matchup ended up going into a draw. My first round was a draw, and it was so unfortunate because it was clear that had there been another turn. Something important to note about this tournament, I guess, which is relevant to this, there were no turns at the end of the 75-minute rounds. So the fact that a win conless Stacks deck went 2-1-1 in a tournament with 75 minutes and no extra turns, which is an environment that is extremely toxic for a win conless Stacks deck. So, like, set up to not succeed in that environment, and the fact that this deck, which is in a bad position in that environment, still did that was awesome. But back to that round, the round 1 in which I did draw, there was clearly a scenario in which I was going to be able to win the next turn. But because my opponents kept having a piece and a piece and a piece to remove my commander over and over again, they weren't getting back into the game. They weren't presenting wins in the game, but they were stopping me winning over and over again long enough to get to the end of that 75-minute round. And because there was no turns, I did not have the opportunity to finally close out the game, which seemed rather inevitable at that point. And it was also a little awkward because I had a really slow start to the game. So had the deck not stumbled a little bit in the beginning, it was pretty clear I would have been able to take it, which is a shame, but hey, here we are. Let's finally get into the creatures. We have our basic Mana Dork package, right? We have Arbor Elf, Avacyn's Pilgrim, Birds of Paradise, Elvish Mystic, Findhorn Elves, Llanowar Elves, Ragavan. There's a ton of artifact hate in the deck. I still think Ragavan's worth it. In the early game, it ramps into your hate pieces, and in the later game, it's still a card advantage engine, and it's just a creature for your commander that has slight upside. Obviously, having so many pieces that make your treasures useless is definitely a thing, but if you play it early enough, that doesn't really matter anyways. Like, I will happily shut off my Ragavan mana if Ragavan allows me to play 2 spells on turn 2, like a Mother of Runes into like a Collector Oof. That I will take that trade any day of the week. Other 1-drops that are relevant: Esper Sentinel. I don't think you should play a white deck without this card. That might be a hot take to some people, but I really don't think that is. I think this is on the level of Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study. This card's insane. Obviously, it is different than those cards, but it is a white 1-drop that you invest in once and then forget about, right? It has the power of Rhystic Study in the sense that you invest once and forget about it, and it has the insanity of Mystic Remora that it costs the initial 1. But the fact that this card gets invested once, is a creature, so it's harder to interact with, and is just there for the rest of the game. And the fact that in this deck specifically, you buff your creatures with Jetmir. So even if you're not buffing your creatures a ton, there were multiple games in which I had the second level of Jetmir out, and people had to pay 3 for Esper Sentinel and could not pay that tax. So that was pretty cool. So it was actually a very relevant line of text that it is equal to Esper Sentinel's power. So that was pretty cool. An interaction that came up, as I said multiple times. Serra Ascendant is like the magnum opus of win conless stacks deck, right? Like, you play Serra Ascendant early in the game and you just immediately start saying, I'm going to put a clock on this battlefield over and over again. And not even to mention what happens when Jetmir hits the battlefield and suddenly, it's hitting for 9 double strike trample lifelink, right? Or like when you have the maximum Jetmir potential. So yeah, Serra Ascendant's awesome. MVP of the deck, Sylvan Safekeeper. It won me, it's hard to say if it like won me multiple games, but there were multiple games where I got it out, and because of that, they were not able to remove, my opponents were not able to remove a pivotal stacks piece, and it was very, very solid multiple games in a row. So Sylvan Safekeeper was awesome. Weather Wayfarer is, I think, is just kind of necessary when you're playing a stacks deck, but especially a stacks deck with green, where you can use this card to go tutor up a Gaia's Cradle, where you can go use this card to tutor up important lands like Boseiju or Aganjo. I was actually playing against a Tabernacle with against a Tabernacle with this deck, a 45 creature deck. And I was able to continue playing that game through a Tabernacle Pendrell Veil. One of the things that I was most impressed about from this deck was that I played an entire game through Tabernacle and was not out of that game until the very end of the game. So super impressed. But Weather Wayfarer was one of my outs during that game. I actually didn't even get to use it because the game ended before I got to untap with Wayfarer. But the fact that I could have gone and gotten Boseiju to shut off the Tabernacle, or the Gaia's Cradle to be able to pay the Tabernacle cost for any of my creatures, was super, super relevant to that game. And then Wayfarer also can just get you a bunch of lands. Sekenzin, this is another actual land for this deck specifically. But as you can see, it can fix my mana. It can get me a land that can cycle. It can get me Iganjo or any of the Kamigawa lands. So Weather Wayfarer is actually really, really solid in this list. Archivist of Agma, brand new card. Wasn't in the live brew because it didn't exist yet. But obviously solid include here. Flash, cheap, efficient body, really solid, and draws you a bunch of cards. As I mentioned, surprising amount of card advantage for a deck that does not play blue or black. Thar Commando, and also playing Outland Liberator. It's just really solid to have artifact and enchantment removal, and the fact that I don't need to have them on bodies that aren't synergistic with our game plan, right? We want them on creatures. So pretty solid, and as I mentioned, having a flash threat was relevant in certain matchups. Collector Roof, MVP of the deck. Can't say that enough. This card's insane. It's awesome in this deck. It's great. Wouldn't have it any other way. Dockside. So Dockside's a little weird, I know, because of literally ridiculous amounts of artifact hate in this deck. However, the early games where it's relevant, it is very, very relevant. I did not see this one in the games at a point in which it was relevant, but once again, this is a smaller sample size for this deck. But fact that I would still play Dockside to make 3 mana so that the next turn I can play a bunch of creatures from this deck. And the fact that it's just a body at the worst case scenario that is just one more body for your commander, I think gives it enough playability to make it fine, given how much, really just a comical amount of artifact hate we play in this deck. Draenith, if you're playing a stacks deck in white, you play this card. I think that's just end of sentence. Hushbringer. So I am playing the creature effects that shut off enter the battlefield abilities. I will say, if the Collector Oof Stony Silence Null Rod package was the MVP of this deck, the closest runner-up is the Hushbringer, Tocatli Arnergard, and Hushwing Griff package. Those cards won me just so many games because of the fact that something that happens, especially when you don't play hard Rule of Laws, is that sometimes your opponents can just kind of scum you out with a Thassa's Oracle Demonic Consultation. And Hushbringer only really shutting down like one or two of the creatures in our deck. Also, good to know that Dockside also gets shut down by these effects. I think when I included Dockside in this list originally, it was before I was playing these anti-enter the battlefield effects. We may have enough things now where I think it's just silly to play Dockside. I still think there's a world in which having it in the early game makes it a little bit worth it, but the more I talk about it, the less I kind of believe that argument. I don't know. I think there are certain games it will win just by being a Dockside extortionist, but we do play a lot of hate for our own Dockside. Anyways, back to Hushbringer. Yeah, as I said, this is the MVP runner-up for this deck. Hushbringer specifically is the best version of that effect. I think it's pretty safe to argue. Also stopping death triggers. So this card particularly really screws over our own Ranger Captain. However, that's fine. It shuts off one card in our deck, but stops our opponents from winning, and especially in winning in ways that the rest of the deck kind of struggles to stop. So Hushbringer is awesome. Catilda was kind of a spicier include. I didn't see it during the games, unfortunately, until I was drawing like 10 cards off of Toski, and by that point it was not the card I wanted to play at the time. But Catilda's really solid. You have a lot of humans in the deck. There is a Winota sub-theme in the list, which may be a little gimmicky, but it was pretty free to include, and that did come up a good amount in the live brew. There was a lot of people spamming play Winota in the chat, and Winota actually, I think, is actually a correct choice in this deck. To be clear, like this isn't like Ian's the Winota primer author, so he put the meme card in. Like I think it's actually a solid include. That being said, we're playing another human in Loyal Apprentice. It's so good with our commander on the battlefield. It is just something that is generating bodies over and over again that are real threats with our commander. And it loses the downside a lot of feeding Docksides because of how much artifact and enter the battlefield and Dockside hate we play. It doesn't really have that downside that it has in other lists, and they're flyers. So, the first time this triggers, if you only have your commander and Loyal Apprentice, you're automatically on that second level where your Thopter is a 2/1 Vigilance flyer and Loyal Apprentice is a 3/1 haste Vigilance. And that's just with your commander and Loyal Apprentice alone. And then you just start snowballing out of control with this card. It's very good in this deck. Phyrexian Broker, I think, is a card you cannot leave home without. I'm also tempted to play a Pithing Needle. That was the card for this deck that probably replaces Damping Sphere. It was one of those things that at the very last minute while I was going through choices of this list, Pithing Needle was the one card that I really wanted to include, but I couldn't find a slot for. Phyrexian Broker is that on a body, which is just even better for our deck. And it's really hard to argue its inclusion. It's an awesome card. It won me a game in the tournament I played the day after this tournament, but that's a whole nother story for a different time. Thalia Garden of Thraben, MVP in this deck. We're playing 45 creatures. It's so punishing to our opponents. I don't really think I can say much more. Adeline is also an MVP of this deck. It is not a stacks piece, but the pressure it puts on the battlefield is stupid. And one thing that really throws people off is Adeline triggers when you attack, not when Adeline attacks. So, for example, you can do some whack stuff like turn 1, play like a Deafening Silence. I think this was literally a curve I did during this tournament. Turn 1, Deafening Silence. Turn 2, Collector Oof. Turn 3, play Adeline, attack someone with Collector Oof, and I get that first trigger off Adeline. That interaction alone, where I played nothing on turn 1, I played 1 2-drop creature on turn 2 and a 3-drop on turn 3. That is immediately 5 bodies on the battlefield on turn 3. And then, if I play my commander the next turn, so that's 6 bodies. We're already on the second level of my commander's ability. And the next time any of those creatures attack, that's 9 bodies right away. Now, in that scenario, you can't have any of your 1/1s blocked. Sure, that's totally fine. If that doesn't work out perfectly like that, but that's a scenario in which you just play some fair magic going like turn 1, do nothing, turn 2, play a creature and attack with it on turn 3 after you play Adeline, and then play your commander. That's it. There's such a minimal expectation there, and Adeline just enables these insane curves where you go from playing nothing to just putting like stupid amounts of pressure on the board. And especially with your commander's ability, it's insane. It's just so good. I would never cut this card from this deck, and that's a hill I'm happy to die on. Mind Sensor, insane stacks piece. Love having it. There's not much more to say. Fabro Elder helps us to, really just one, it is bodies on the battlefield. It starts with Vigilance. It immediately becomes a 3/3 with your commander on the battlefield. It's putting a lot of pressure on the battlefield. It's often a 4/3 because, at minimum, it's triggering one time with your commander. I can't say enough stuff about this. So we're playing all of the creature Thalia effects. So we have Thalia, we have Glow Rider, we have Vryn Wingmare. Vryn Wingmare, obviously a little better because it has flying, but Glow Rider earns its place in that sense. Hushwing Griff, we already talked about. Facebreaker. Now, once again, I talked about all the artifact hate that we have in this deck, but Facebreaker is actually more of a card advantage engine in this list. So yes, if we don't have any of our artifact hate specifically, Facebreaker is fine at just being a ramp piece, right? It generates a good amount of advantage, but it's also just card advantage, right? So, we're trying to put a lot of pressure on our opponents with this deck specifically. So Facebreaker just being able to do that, be a menace attacker, and then have this thing where I can like exile the cards off the top of my library, and it turns Dockside into a not useless card later in the game. Ranger Captain is a white all-star. If you're playing any amount of creatures in your list, I think you play Ranger Captain. Like, it's just so good. Sanctum Prelate might be one of the best stacks creatures of all time. I don't think it's hard to argue that. It is amazing at stopping board wipes. So if, for example, like, you're playing against a black deck, for example, I did this the other day when I was playing Winota, playing a Sanctum Prelate and just naming the number 3 because I knew the only board wipes my opponents were likely to have was Toxic Deluge, and it set up a great scenario for me to win that game. It was like my silver bullet to be able to stop that card. There's a lot of times where your opponents have a lot of interaction in hand. You can say the number 2, that's a really popular one, stops Tainted Pact, which is a really big win condition, stops Underworld Breach, a lot of stuff like that. So Sanctum Prelate on 2 and 3 is often, I found, the most potent. Sometimes people put it on 1. I don't know how I feel about that specifically, but it's a thing. Isan and Captain Sisay. Unfortunately, I didn't play any insanely grindy pods, and that's kind of where these two shine. And I didn't see them until later. So, for example, the one game I had Captain Sisay in a really early hand was that early game in which I was stumbling for mana. I think Captain Sisay is actually like cracked in this deck. Winota, Toski, Linvala, Elish Norn, all of those are legendary creatures. Along the fact that you can get Gaia's Cradle, you can get all of your legendary lands from Kamigawa. Yeah, Sisei's insane. And Yisan in a stacks deck is just solid, right? It is constantly putting more and more creatures onto your battlefield. It uses your mana up. It plays around actual rule of laws if you're going against that type of mirror match. And it's super easy to grab with all of the green tutors in the deck, things like Green Sun Zenith and Worldly Tutor and all those things. Yisan is just a really solid option, and I think it's just really good to have in a stacks deck. Linvala, one of the best silver bullets of all time as far as creature stacks in cEDH. It just stops so many strategies, and it stops strategies that are good at stopping stacks decks. It stops things like Thrasios grinding a ton of advantage engines without ever casting spells. It stops things like Hulk decks that are going to try and go underneath your stacks effects. Basically, most of the things that stacks are bad against, Linvala shores up that weakness, and the fact that it's also a 3/4 flyer is insanely relevant because it puts a dumb amount of pressure on your opponent's life totals. Linvala is awesome. As I mentioned, we have Winota in the deck. Let's count the humans. We have one. So we have 21 hits with Winota, and I didn't think I included Winota in that math. So 21 hits is super solid. And once again, the whole point of what our commander wants from us is to just dump a stupid amount of things onto the battlefield. So attacking with Winota and just super dumping stuff on the battlefield, it's exactly what we want to do. Winota does that, and it does it very, very well. Toski, I've already talked about a lot. Probably the number 1 tutor target in the deck for me because of its efficiency mana-wise, how easy it is to cast. Now, Orin Frostfang is basically the same thing, and it does interact super well with our commander because it gives attacking creature Death Touch. So we talked about earlier how well Trample interacts with Death Touch. Toski just happened to be the one that was a little easier to tutor in the games I was playing, and obviously, yeah, costing less is really relevant, and the fact that it's indestructible and uncounterable is absolutely huge. But Orin Frostfang in a game where you need to be a little grindier is also just wildly insane. It just provides a ton of advantage for you. The fact that you're connecting with all of the creatures that you already want to be playing anyways is great. Tendershoot Dryad's an army in a can. So if you're in a situation in which like there's a lot of removal happening, they're trying to remove a lot of your resources, the board gets wiped, tons of stuff like that. Tendershoot Dryad is a card that just one card can scrape you back into the game out of nowhere. A solid include, and it's one of my favorite stacks finishers of all time. And when your commander cares about going wide, this card just gets even better. Archon of Valor's Reach, and if you're noticing, I have a lot of fat creatures in this curve, right? This curve is insanely big, and as soon as I'm done explaining all of the individual ones, I will kind of go into a diatribe as to why I'm doing that. Archon of Valor's Reach is one of the most insane stacks creatures of all time. It's also costed to be that, but it has Flying, Vigilance, Trample, so like it comes down, the body is very real, and you just shut off a card type from being cast, period. So naming instants, naming sorceries if you're afraid of board wipes is just so crippling to certain decks, and this did win me a game, if not put me in the advantage to win the game that drew. I can't remember which game it was, but I do remember Archon was extremely impactful in one of the games we played, and it's also like one of my favorite natural order targets for really early in the game, so super happy with that card. Everbrook Caretaker is a card that I really enjoy. I think it's really solid. I have wanted to play it for a while, and the fact that there was like Winota synergies in this kind of made it like that extra bit for me. But the fact that it is a threat you can invest in, and it has hexproof, so it's just going to keep doing its thing. And if you don't cast a spell, it just becomes immediately bonkers, right? So card's really good. And Elish Norn, as I mentioned before, we want to have ways to not need our commander. Elish Norn is one of those, right? It's one of my favorite things to tutor with Captain Sisay. It wipes your opponent's boards, it puts a ton of advantage on your board, and even if their creatures survive, the size of your creatures is so much more imposing now because you have Elish Norn that it really doesn't matter. So let's talk about why there are so many large creatures in this deck. I think, especially when you're going through the win conless strategy, Spleenface said it really, really well one time, which is, after you play your stacks pieces, you need to win the casual game that ensues, right? So what happens when your opponents can't do degenerate things is you have to play a fair game of Commander, right? And although it may seem like this end of the curve is really heavy, it never felt that way when I was playing this deck, because of the fact that we can do so many things in the early game, and then by the time we can ramp into this stuff, it just feels like an inevitable part of what we're already doing. And the advantage that you gain by having Toski, you're hitting your land drops every turn, or Orin Frostfang, or even Winota, you're just doing the thing every single turn. You're shutting down your opponents so wholly and completely that they just cannot do the dumb broken stuff. And then you just play a card like Tendershoe Dryad, or your commander, or Archon of Valor's Reach, or Elish Norn that just says, you have been stopped, but that's not enough. I need to now end this. I need to finish this game. I could never have competed in a 75-minute tournament that has no extra turns if I didn't have this top end. And I think a lot of stacks decks that are especially going towards a win conless strategy sort of have been lacking this part, and I think this fundamental part of the strategy, which is you need stuff at the top end that just beats your opponent down so completely that there's no ambiguity to it, right? You can't just, so if you're playing like Timna Kamal, you can't just rely on Kamal. Kamal costs 8 mana, and if it dies once, it goes to 10 mana. You cannot rely on that being the only way to win these games. You need to have redundancy, and you need to have redundancy that doesn't just say like, oh, Draenith Magistrate's out, I can't close the game. That's terrible, right? Like, you don't want to end in that position, which is why we have Jetmir. Jetmir is Crater Hoof in the command zone, but that doesn't mean we don't want our other Crater Hoofs, right? We don't want things that are going to snowball out of control super quickly. We don't want the things that are going to wipe our opponent's board and just beat them down so wholly, right? We need those things. So because of that, that's why this top end looks like that. And I think it's a really important part of any combat damage related stack strategy. And I think there has been a precedent of people really missing that part of it. And I think it's been a big part of why there isn't a lot of win conless stacks that has been present at exactly like winning a ton of tournaments. And I think it has to do with this construction of deck philosophy. This is something I'd really like to hear people's opinions on in the comments. So if you have any opinions on this sort of mentality when we're talking about building stacks, I'd love to hear them in the comment below. And this also concludes our deck for today. Jetmir was such a surprise to play, because I really did not think I would do as well as I did with this list. And when I was playing it, I didn't expect to feel as in control of every game I was playing. Like, I've played win conless stacks before, but something about the way this list worked together just felt so clean and efficient, and it felt like I wasn't despite being in scenarios like my nightmare scenario, like being locked under a tabernacle in a 45 creature deck, I never felt like I couldn't do something in these games. And even in my semifinals matchup that I lost, it was really because someone like refilled a Turbo Nos player who had already been super ahead, right? But even in that scenario, I still felt like, had the game not really like been swung so heavily in that player's favor, that I would have been able to continually lock it down over time in what seemed like a really tough matchup. So really happy with the performance of this deck. I would play this at a tournament again. I really suggest people do. If you have any suggestions on cards you might think should go in this deck, I'd love to hear about that. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's sort of like a hybrid of multiple videos I've done before, because it's half a tournament report talking about real things that happened during this top 16 run with this deck, and half a deck tech of a really cool deck that I know caught a lot of people off guard. I don't think this was like a Magda effect where I like caught people off guard so much, because it was very clear what I was doing from the very beginning, and you can read Jetmir and get what I'm doing, right? Like there's no ambiguity of like what my deck is trying to do. It's trying to kill people with combat damage, and it's trying to slow them down while I do it. So I don't think the surprise factor was necessarily a thing in my matchups, but I can definitely see it was really cool to have people definitely not expect it to perform as well as it did, and even I didn't expect it to perform as well as it did. And overall, I'm just so happy with this list. I'm gonna keep working on it, because it really it surprised me in such a positive way, and I really hope you enjoyed my deck tech of Chonky Kitty win game. God, I love these meme names, and I know there's a whole movement about people not wanting to do meme names, but this deck I think is explanatory enough where you get that you play stacks pieces and you hit people. Either way, I'm really proud of how this deck came out. I'm really proud of my performance. So between Chaos 3 and the day afterwards, I top 16 2 tournaments in a row, 2 days in a row, and it felt really awesome to do that. And I hope you enjoyed this deck tech. If you enjoy this, please hit like and subscribe. Leave those comments down below. It helps me know that you guys enjoy this, and I love when people engage in these videos. I love hearing people's opinions. If you notice, I like heart a ton of different comments, because I genuinely love hearing people's input. It's really an awesome part of being a creator, is hearing your opinions, stuff like that. If you enjoyed this deck, make sure to leave that like. And if you enjoyed videos like this, if you want to be part of the voting process that got me to play this deck in a tournament, feel free to check out patreon.com/comedianmtg. Any help goes a long way for this channel. Thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you next time. Peace.
I can feel the blood creeping up from the heathens. Got will, got fight, got pride, got reason. If they wanna go eat, then you know I'm gonna feed them. If you're coming for me, hope you're ready for a demon. I got eyes in the back of my head, I'm seeing